So what if I told you guys that the way we use tarot cards today is all because of a French pastor who made up this myth with zero sources? Hi, I'm Heather, and this is Delusional Witch Juice, where we get into the shockingly suppressed history, the reality behind folklore, and the origins of conspiracies that you should definitely know about. Okay, wow, so that first episode was a rough one. I'm definitely a little rusty, and I said I would do this weekly, but of course, I dilly-dallied. But thank you to everyone who listened and shared the first episode. There's so much more that I wanted to say about Beltane, but I'm trying to keep this podcast light and not like a whole college history lecture course. So a little bit of background. My occult curiosity first started with tarot cards and how to read them. And everyone has kind of dabbled, I'm sure. But I'm sitting here thinking, where did these cute little artsy cards come from? And who assigned meaning to all these? And why do we use them in the first place? So in this episode, I went down a huge tarot card rabbit hole, which is why it took so long for me to publish this episode. So every good story has a fool in it, and sometimes it's a guy who completely makes up history at a dinner party, and sometimes it's a grain merchant who sees a business opportunity in someone else's lie, and then sometimes it's a Nobel Prize winner who is guarding a doorway, blocking a man in ceremonial robes. In this episode, we talk about all of those, but we'll start at the beginning, which fittingly is exactly where the fool lives. So grab yourself a drink and let's get into it. So it's Paris, 1781, and you're in a candlelit salon, sitting on a gilded sofa, and you're attending this weekly intellectual dinner party. It's basically just a fancy living room of people who are very aware of how smart they are, and then your host asks you to come over to a card table, and just as she's laying down the Tower card, Antoine Court de Gébelin walks in. And everybody's, ooh, it's Anthony. There's soft whispers across the room. They're like, oh, he's a Protestant pastor. Oh, and one was like, oh, I heard he's a Freemason. And another's, oh, I heard he wrote a whole 9-volume encyclopedia. So this is a man with opinions about everything, and he has no hesitation sharing them, and everybody knows him, right? So you're all playing cards. And he walks by and he glimpses one of the cards on the table, stops dead in his tracks, and 15 minutes later, he's mansplaining the whole entire 78 card deck and claiming that it all came from ancient Egypt. This man has no sources, no research. He's literally just going off vibes. And his justification is, in his own words, this is in his book, I glanced at it immediately and understood the allegory. That's it. That's the source. That's how confident this man is. And the room of smart people ate it up. So being considered smart for his time, he convinced everyone in the room that these cards came from the Hermetic text composed by Hermes, the Greek name applied to the Egyptian god Thoth, which is a whole nother episode for another time, but Thoth's writings included many revelations on occult subjects and theology, but Antony completely made this up about the cards. Antony claimed that the text suggested that these priests would use cards to foretell divine events. And again, nobody questioned him. Like, you would think in like a whole room of intellectuals, someone would have pushed back and been like, wait a minute, and exactly how do you know this? But again, people loved it. People ate it up. And I mean, by 1781, tarot had already existed for 350 years as an Italian card game. And that was a recorded fact, but he just chose to ignore that. So forget everything that Anthony just said, and let me tell you where it actually came from. So tarot cards, as we know them today, were invented in northern Italy somewhere between 1430 and 1440 as a Renaissance card game. There was nothing mystical about them, nothing ancient, literally just a fancy game of bridge for people in the court. And we know this because the earliest surviving deck belonged to the Visconti Sofras family, and it was commissioned by Filippo Maria, Duke of Milan. To give you the real story, we have to back up even further than Milan because before anyone was commissioning anything, it was just a regular ass card game. A regular card game that didn't come from Italy. It actually came from Egypt. And yes, you heard me right. You were like, wait, Heather, weren't you just shading Court de Gébelin for claiming that tarot cards came from Egypt? And yes, I did. But they weren't Egyptian in the way he meant it, and we'll come back to that. But playing cards were basically invented by the Mamluk Sultanate and arrived in Europe via Islamic Egyptian traders who were sailing into Italian and Spanish ports around 1370. So picture yourself on the docks of an Italian port. Salt air, smell of fish, the groan of ships coming in and unloading. And you notice a group of traders huddled in the corner, and they're like shuffling and dealing cards and laughing. They genuinely seem to be having a good time. And you watch for a while, and then you go over there and talk one of them into trading you for the deck of cards. And then you're so fascinated with them that on your break, you teach your fellow dock workers, you're like, oh, hey, look at this deck of cards that we've never seen before that I got from these Islamic traders. And so you're showing them everything, and you're showing them that the deck has 4 suits. It has polo sticks, coins, swords, and cups. Now, you recognize 3 of these if you're into tarot. The polo sticks became wands or batons because Europeans literally looked at them and went, that's just a stick. Polo was not a familiar concept. Anyway, moving on. Within about a decade, playing cards had spread across most of Europe. And we know this mainly because cities kept immediately banning them. The very first written mention of playing cards in Europe was in 1367 from Bern, Switzerland. And it's a document about banning playing cards because they were using them for gambling. So, right out of the gate, problematic. It was just an innocent card game, and of course humans ruined it and started gambling with them. And then so by the early 1400s, the Italians had a thriving card game culture. The 4-suit deck was everywhere. Now enter Filippo Maria Visconti, the Duke of Milan. He's a paranoid recluse who lived mostly in his fortified castle, didn't like the sunlight. He was deeply self-conscious about his appearance, and he was an enormous arts buff. He loved art. So he took a look at this 4-suit deck and said, I can make this better. So it's 1418, and Filippo's pacing the hallways of his heavily fortified stone castle, right? And he's bored and just thinking of the next thing to do, contemplating what he can possibly do to fill this void. And he's heard whisperings throughout the court about this card game that everybody's obsessed with across Europe. So naturally, he wants a deck of his own, but the everyday 4-suit deck with its common lines and primary colors just simply won't do. He's a duke. He wants his own extravagant version. He wants a deck that would set his apart from all the other decks. We're not talking something simple. So he calls upon his court secretary, who also happens to be a humanist scholar and an astrologer. We love that. And he asks him for a card deck. He basically explains to him, okay, I have an idea for an allegorical card game, but I want it to be based off virtues and temptations. So his secretary goes and does exactly that. He comes back with a deck that's like extravagant, right? The deck still has 4 suits, but he added 4 extra trump cards depicting Roman gods and birds, which people love their birds. But these trump cards essentially acted as a 5th suit. So unfortunately, that deck no longer exists. It's lost, gone, never to be seen again. But the reason we know it existed is because the secretary who helped devise the deck actually wrote a book. And in it, he mentions, and I love this phrasing, that the Duke invented a new and exquisite kind of triumphs, which is like the most Duke of Milan thing I have ever read. So this new type of card deck was referred to carte de triomphe, or trump cards in English. And the extra illustrated cards on top of the 4-suit deck is what makes tarot. So fast forward 20 years and many fancy card decks later, and the Visconti Sofras family wants another deck. But again, they want to one-up everything they've already done. So they want one that outdoes every other deck that they've had before. So they call in Bonifacio Bimbo. And yes, that is his real last name. I've looked it up and how to pronounce it. His last name is Bimbo. So I'm just rolling with that. But Bimbo was their favorite painter, and what he produces is honestly extraordinary and might be one of the greatest card decks ever. So he goes into his stone workshop, right? And he stretches and scrapes calfskin until it's like smooth and white. And then he takes a fine stylus and sketches each illustration on the cards. And then to take it a step further, he applies plaster where gold leaf will go. And I'm telling you, this gold leaf is so thin that if you breathe on it wrong, it would tear. Also, he paints with blues and greens. He paints with other colors too, but I mentioned the blue and green because these pigments were actually ground from semi-precious stone. So blue and green were very too expensive pigments at the time. So he did all 78 cards this way, each one by hand, and this was months of work. And in the images, the figures he painted in the images, these weren't just generic people, right? So the Visconti family was blonde, which is unusual for northern Italy, but Bimbo painted the figures on the cards blonde. So the Empress, the Emperor, the court cards, these were basically portraits of the Visconti Sofras family. And it was basically a status object that announced very clearly that the Visconti family were the ones that invented this card deck. So word travels fast, even back then without social media, and everybody wanted one. All the other courts wanted one immediately for their own. And this deck actually, the one that Bimbo created, this deck actually went back to the standard 4 suits, the cups, the swords, the coins, and the sticks, wands, batons, whatever you want to call them. But the added illustrated trump cards plus the Fool card, that's 78 cards total, and that's basically the structure. 4 suits plus 21 extra cards, and that's basically tarot as we know it today. So like I mentioned earlier, all the other courts saw that the Visconti Sofras family had these, and within 20 years of the Visconti deck, Court across northern Italy were commissioning their own. Milan, Ferrara, Florence, Venice, but they didn't just copy it. They customized theirs to make it fit what they wanted, right? So now we have customized playing cards. So the Este family in Florence actually commissioned a deck where all the trump cards were themed around love, not members of the court. Instead of the Tower and the Hermit, their cards were named Idlest, Reason, Desire, and Secrecy. And each one had a little 3-line poem about love on the back. Then, of course, as most trends, it gets mass-produced. So the printing press arrived in Italy around 1465. And within a generation, you could get a woodblock printed deck for a fraction of the cost. No gold leaf, no hand-painted, basically like the Walmart version of these court decks. And nowhere got more into producing tarot cards than Marseille. By the late 1600s, the city of Marseille had become the tarot manufacturing of the capital of the world. A printer named Nicholas Conver actually standardized the deck around 1760, and that version became the deck. The bold lines, the primary colors, and it was actually affordable. It dominated Europe and tarot for 200 years before anyone bothered to name it, but they eventually named it Tarot de Marseille, which this wasn't suggested until 1856. But it's nothing crazy. It's basically just saying the tarot of the city of Marseille. And here's the crazy twist. So we come back to Court de Gébelin. Walking into that dinner party in 1781, he glanced at the card on the table and declared the whole thing was ancient Egyptian. And the deck he was looking at, probably most likely, was a Nicolas Conver Tarot de Marseille deck. And it was a mass-produced French wooden block print. made in Masal 20 years later, and he pointed at it and called it Egyptian, but the Egyptian part was already there. So we can all agree that Antony's claim from 1781 is like off base, but I won't entirely blame him because of his timing. So Egyptomania, you've heard of Beatlemania, right? Egyptomania was like all over Europe in the 1780s, and it wasn't just people like adding Sphinx to their furniture. It was a genuine like intellectual obsession with the idea that ancient Egypt had figured out something that we had lost. Like, educated people were searching for proof of timeless wisdom, and they were hoping to find that it existed and had been handed down somehow. So Court de Gébelin didn't just say tarot looked Egyptian, he said it was actual proof of this ancient knowledge, and that's a very different claim. And in 1781, because of Egyptomania, people were ready to believe it. So Court de Gébelin publishes his essay in 1781 and moved on with his life. He had 9 volumes of an encyclopedia to work on and salons to attend, so he wasn't particularly interested in what came next. So we have a grain merchant in Paris who was John Baptiste Alida, had no Latin, no university education, no membership in any salon or secret society. He sold grain. So he was like the exact type of person Antoine Court de Gébelin would have walked past at a dinner party without making eye contact. But the thing that set him apart was like he could read. And he read Antony's entire essay. And where Court de Gébelin saw an intellectual curiosity, Eliot saw something that the pastor had completely missed, which was a system, a teachable, reputable system that ordinary people would pay to learn. So he basically saw a business opportunity. And I have to mention, he reversed his surname. Eliot became Italia, because of course it did, and he reinvented himself as an occultist when this all went down. So he published his own response to Court de Gébelin's essay within a year. And then he built the first tarot deck that was meant for divination. Then he cashed in. He wrote instruction manuals. He taught classes. He did readings. He invented the spread layouts that we still use it today. And of course, he charged for all of it. So our man Antony, the Protestant pastor, had the idea. The grain merchant built the product, and everything that the Golden Dawn would do later, everything that Waite and Pamela Smith would eventually put on paper, it was all built on a foundation that a man with no credentials and a reverse surname constructed almost entirely alone. Talk about a business plan. Ew. Okay, but you're probably still thinking this one man couldn't be the reason for the entire tarot card obsession we have today. And you'd be completely right, because a group of people in London decided to take this thing several thousand steps further. They were called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Dramatic, I know. But they were founded in 1888. And I need you to understand, these were not just casual hobbyists. They were talking customized robes, elaborate initiation rituals, ceremonies involved staged hangings. This was a commitment. And the membership list is where it gets unhinged, but in the best possible way. So we have W.B. Yeats. He's an Irish poet and a Nobel Prize winner. He joined in 1890 and was completely serious about it for the rest of his life. This was supposed to be a secret society, but he just couldn't help telling people that he was a member of the Golden Dawn. Anyway, this is a man who once organized a committee to... Okay, this is gonna sound crazy, but just stay with me here. This guy organized a group of people to burn a flower, stay with me, to burn a flower like a plant down to ashes, then place the ashes in a bell-shaped jar, and then put that jar under the moonlight and wait for the ghost of the flower to appear. I can't even say it seriously because it just sounds so ridiculous. I'm into spiritual rituals and everything, but he literally took a flower, burned it, put it in a jar under the moonlight, and waited for its ghost to appear. Of course, it didn't work, but he kept doing this. Then there was Aleister Crowley, who joined in 1898, and he was immediately too much for everyone. And when I say too much, I think you'll get what I'm saying. The London Lodge refused to promote him because he was just too much for everybody. And he went to Paris, where they accepted him for who he was and got initiated by the leader of that lodge. And then he came back to the London Lodge and tried to seize control. And he caused a lot of drama. There was like legal proceedings and everything. And our man, W.B. Yeats, the Nobel Prize winner, flower ghost guy, physically stood in the doorway and barred Crowley from entering. And Crowley was expelled, obviously, but the whole scene in my mind is just funny. These two middle-aged white men, one a Nobel Prize winner, another one who was just trying to fit in, fighting over getting in the lodge. It's just hilarious. Crowley actually later invented his own tarot deck and named it the Thoth Tarot. Thoth, if you remember earlier in the episode, the Egyptian god. And he did this based off the Egyptian texts that Court de Gébelin had invented in connection back to his essay in 1781. So I don't really know if that's an homage or if it's just cosmic comedy. I genuinely cannot tell you. But here's what the Golden Dawn actually did. Beyond the robes and the staged embalments and everything else, they basically built the skeleton for Tara. They mapped the 22 major Arcana cards onto the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they also connected it to the Kabbalistic tree of life and the whole structure of the divine, the 10 spheres, each one representing a different aspect of existence. And then all of a sudden a regular card game it had layers, right? So now they have astrological correspondence, numerological meetings. Each has its own Hebrew letter and its position on the tree. This wasn't just a card with a picture of a tower on it anymore. This was like an entire system. And that system is exactly why a man named Arthur Edward Waite, which might sound familiar, commissioned an artist to draw all of the 78 cards, and this artist had an enormous amount to encode into each image because of all the layers that the Golden Dawn had added. So Waite was actually one of Golden Dawn's own members, and he joined in 1891, and he absorbed everything that the Golden Dawn had built, and he eventually decided he wanted to take it a step further, and not necessarily into more ritual, but he wanted something tangible, like something people could physically hold in their hands. Arthur Edward Waite was actually born in Brooklyn, New York, to an English mother and an American father. And it's said, but not confirmed, that his father died at sea, and that's why his family had to move back to England. And when he was only 17 years old, his younger sister died. So some say it was from the plague. It's not confirmed. But obviously, this grief sent him into a spiral, and it sent him somewhere that not a lot of 17-year-olds at the time would go, which was straight into the deep end of Western occultism and philosophy. And he spent a lot of his 20s alone in British museums reading occult texts, which, like, honestly, in my 20s, I probably should have done that instead of taking shots at the bar, but no one's perfect. But somewhere in all of that, somewhere inside that Brooklyn Catholic kid, this guy became one of the most serious ceremonial magicians in all of England. So naturally, he joined the Freemasons and a couple other secret societies, including the Golden Dawn. But when the Golden Dawn eventually collapsed because of their own drama, he actually founded his own secret society called the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, which is another thing I have to go dig into. But this was a man who could not stop joining and starting secret societies, which is either a personality trait or some kind of weird coping mechanism. It's possibly both, but I don't know. What Waite actually cared about was pulling Kabbalah, Christian mysticism, and ceremonial magic all into one coherent system. And Tara, like I mentioned before, he believed that was the perfect vessel for it all. So the artist he commissioned, everyone called her Pixie, but her real name was Pamela Coleman Smith, and she was born in London, and she was actually raised between Jamaica, New York, and England. So she spent her whole entire childhood absorbing every cultural thing at the time. And she actually studied at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn and designed costumes and sets for the theater. And by the time she joined the Order of the Golden Dawn, which I think is really cool that they admitted women, but she was already a well-known artist with an eye for symbolism and staging that most occultists could only theorize about. So that's why Waite came to her to commission his deck of cards. He didn't need someone who understood tarot academically. The Golden Dawn already had plenty of those people. He needed someone who could illustrate that, who could take 600 years of history and Kabbalistic structure and symbolism and make it visible on a card deck. And Pixie could do that in her sleep. She had been staging scenes for an audience her whole entire life. So in 1901, she sat down with a deck of Tarot de Marsal, the one back from Italy, and she took those bold line woodblock printed cards from the Marcel workshops and got to work, okay? The theater background shows in every card. So 78 cards, each one by hand. She encoded 600 years of symbolism into every image and was paid once for it. Flat fee, no royalties. She died in 1951 with essentially nothing. The deck made Waite's career is still commonly based off of is the Rider-Waite deck, and her name gets added on when people are trying to be careful. But we're being careful, and it's the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and she's the reason it works. So when you visit your local metaphysical store, which I hope is where you're buying your tarot cards, and you pick up a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, you're basically holding 600 years of symbolism that was all made because a Catholic kid who lived in Brooklyn wanted to get into occultism, and he was friends with a Jamaican-British woman who was also an incredible artist who were part of the same secret society, and together they created the most iconic tarot card deck ever. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about the history and the drama, but I bet your number one question is still, okay, but do the cards actually work? So this is what we know. Historical records show us that the symbols come from Italy. They don't tell us what happens when you lay them all out in a Celtic cross under a full moon. But the modern reading of tarot is this. The major arcana are seen as archetype human experiences. The tower is not a literal tower. It's like the feeling of everything around you collapsing that needed to collapse. For example, you hate your job, it's toxic, everyone's quitting, and you're starting to ask yourself, should I quit too? So this is why the Egyptian myths, while historically wrong, resonated with people. The practice of intuitive reading and sitting with imagery and letting it help you come to a conclusion or an understanding of something that you already know deep within, that's a tale as old as time, but we cannot confirm that it was purely Egyptian. So overall, the receipts say Northern Italy. The feeling says or feels like it's something ancient, and I think it's okay to hold on to both. Tarot has been a cultural representation of people just looking for an answer. And I am not wrong when I say, I think I'm not wrong anyway, that there has been a huge resurgence of tarot reading in the last decade. And I actually looked this up. Research states that in 2025, that 30% of US adults consulted an astrologer, a tarot reader, or a medium at least once a year. So we can also thank Instagram and TikTok for the aesthetic mainstream decks that are now mass marketed in every visual language. Hashtag witch talk. But the amount of tarot decks that are out there right now, there's kitten tarot, botanical tarot, queer tarot. There's even a Pulp Fiction tarot deck, which is insane. So there's like this whole debate in the tarot reading community about whether it matters if you have your grandma's old deck from like 1950 or one from Urban Outfitters that you bought in 2021. If you got your tarot deck off Amazon, what does that mean? Will it still work? And I will say, out of the 5 decks that I have, the one that I use the most and I feel most drawn to, it was actually gifted to me by another practitioner. But that's not to say that the one you got from Target just before listening to this podcast isn't going to work. It's all about the imagery and what those images mean to you. So, I'm going to leave you with this. I'm going to leave you with the Fool card. Card 0. And so Filippo Maria Visconti's card game from 1442. The Fool was a wild card. It basically had no rules, no suit. You can play it at any time, and it basically changed everything. So when the Order of the Golden Dawn came along and mapped out all the tarots onto the Kabbalah Tree of Life, they gave it the number 0 and placed it outside the number sequence entirely. It's just out here on its own. So now in modern readings, it's the card of new beginnings. And if you've ever seen it before, it's a fool standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step off, and he just seems happy-go-lucky. And one starts to think, does he see the cliff there, or is he just stepping off unaware? So that's basically what the Fool card is about. The Fool card is the only card that never needed reinterpreting. The Grain Merchant from 1789 didn't need to reassign the meaning of the card. The Golden Dawn didn't need to argue the meaning of the Fool card. And Pamela Smith, Pixie, drew it as it already was. So 600 years of the wild card, and the meaning has always been the same. You can play this at any moment, and everything changes. So that's your homework. So pull out a deck of cards or a deck of playing cards, deck of tarot cards, look up a picture of it online, find the Fool card, and ask yourself, where in your life are you refusing to play the wild card right now? What cliff are you standing on the edge of? And that's your reading for the week. I know. I'm a genius. Now you know how tarot went from being a regular deck of cards from Islamic Egypt to a fancy card game in Milan to a myth made up by a French pastor, and then a secret society connecting it to the Kabbalah, and then Pamela Smith drew the 78 cards that we know today, and that's what's sitting on your nightstand. So, whatever brought you to tarot, whether it was ancient practice or of divination or some drunk cousin whipping it out last Christmas going on about their Saturn return, you're holding cards that have been shuffled around for 600 years, and that part is real, even if the French pastor made it all up and lied. I did a lot of research on this episode, and I am a research girly, and I will always name the sources that I use. I'm not going to name all of them, but all the sources will be in the show notes. But the main sources for this episode include the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Tarot History piece, which is genuinely a beautiful piece, and it's free online if you want to look at that. There's also the Morgan Library's Visconti Sulfraz collection. They have the actual cards also online for you to view. Then Collectors Weekly ran a piece called Tarot Mythology, by Hunter Ottman Stanford, and it's one of the best debunks of the Egyptian myth that I found, and I'll link that in the show notes. Mary K. Greer's Tarot blog has a translation of Court de Gébelin's original 1781 essay, and she's one of the most respected tarot historians working right now, so definitely check that out. And then the ArtNet news piece on Pamela Coleman Smith, the artist, it's called The Artist and Oculist Who Designed the Iconic Tarot Deck and Why Has No One Ever Heard of Her Name? That's a mouthful, I know, but that headline says it all. And that will also be in the show notes, along with other sources, other minor sources that I got information from. I also want to thank all 5 of my dedicated listeners who have been listening since 2021, since I used to talk about pop culture in my friend's basement. So I want to thank you for joining me on this mystical rebrand, and I hope you're enjoying it. Don't forget to share and subscribe and tell your friends. I'm really excited about this new vision I have for the podcast, so I'll leave you with that. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye.